our next session, we'll be talking about accelerating ideas. The speed of innovation isn't always smooth. There's quite a bit of hurry up and wait that happens as ideas mature from academic exercises to technological marvels. We'll use this session to talk about what hurries ideas along, what fuels accelerated innovation, and how do you handle it effectively when an idea suddenly takes off. I'd like to introduce Anna Blakeney and Richard Zhang. Richard is a senior research scientist at Adobe. He invented the visual similarity algorithms underlying image-generating AI models like Stable Diffusion and StyleGAN. Well, welcome. I'm so glad that you both are here. And you both are in fields that have accelerated dramatically over the past few years, to say the least. To start, can you tell me a little bit more about what you're working on now and how the pace of your work has changed?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work on generative modeling in the AI space, which is known as Gen AI. One big thing that's changed is that things are really working now. So in particular, I'm working on kind of the sub area related to computer vision and graphics, so the science and engineering of creating machines that can see and understand and even generate visual content. Back in grad school, a lot of the things that we were pushing on and trying to work on was making this technology work, trying to make sure that it's high quality, that it's producing perceptually pleasing results, that it's controllable for creators of all different skill levels. And I'm still working on a lot of that now, but now that this work is really kind of proliferated around our everyday world and it's gone mainstream, really I'm trying to think about how to build a healthy ecosystem for everyone involved. So that includes consumers like you and me, making sure that we can understand the visual content around us, knowing what's real and what's fake, as well as contributors, because these machines ultimately are trained on data. We want to make sure that contributors are also recognized for their contributions. So yeah, there's just a lot more people in the space. It's really exciting, and that's kind of directed the work that the way we thought about this work as well, trying to build a healthy ecosystem really for everyone.
Yeah, and it is amazing how with both of your fields, they're very different, but they have changed so much in what is really a relatively short time. I'm curious about the process of how you adjust to those rapid accelerations. Do you just roll with it and go with the flow? Do you keep doing what you're doing and ignore some of that hype cycle? How does your work change, or does it? Richard, why don't we start with you this time?
Definitely. So it's I feel it's always a kind of balance between being aware of what's going on out there, but also not being overly influenced by it. So actually looking back, I mean, I've been in this field around 10 or so years now. So about half of it was as a grad student at Berkeley, half as a researcher here at Adobe. And when I look back at the very beginning, things were really accelerating. And I was actually having kind of a hard time getting a foothold in the field. And what I kind of learned from my advisor, who was really wonderful and supportive at the time, was that sometimes you don't have to necessarily kind of really go with the crowd. You can kind of slow down, and that can actually let you accelerate a bit on the long term as well. So it's kind of this balance between being aware of what's really out there, but also finding your specific niche and where you can contribute as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting, the idea of kind of slowing down in order to speed up. And I am curious about, how much of this is just really good timing or really lucky timing. Is that something that you found where you do kind of have to seize that moment when it comes up? Is that something that you're kind of on the lookout for? I'm curious what your experiences have been.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
that
I'll
makes
speak a bit to my experience as well. So yeah, it's definitely kind of a mixture between luck and also one other thing I learned from my advisor is you can kind of make yourself lucky. Like they've done studies that, people who are just kind of more kind of aware of what's around them or open to serendipity actually can actually find their way into luck in some respect. So in some of my experience, I mean, when I was first starting, there was a lot of activity around uh, I started in 2012. That's actually when AlexNet came out, which is when deep learning really started taking off, and there was a lot of work on kind of on perceptual models. Um, and we were doing something kind of a little bit different, trying to do this generative modeling thing, which at the time was really difficult. There was limited compute, limited data. We really didn't have all the tools that we have now. But we kind of saw that maybe this is the beginning of something that could be big. So it's kind of a mixture of being at the right place at the right time, but also finding some sort of interesting niche that you can kind of drive towards.
Yeah, finding that niche is so key. And one of the things that strikes me, and you touched on it very briefly, is that there is an element of kind of intersectionality in a lot of technological developments these days. And both of you started out initially studying different fields. Like Anna, yours was chemical engineering. Richard, you were in electrical engineering. Can you tell us a little bit about how those backgrounds have helped in your current work?
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, you touched on, I started off in electrical engineering. So I was an ECE major with electrical and computer engineering back in undergrad. Back then I was working on like something very different. I was really focused on integrated circuits, and I was also doing some signal processing. I ended up working in radar systems for a few years before starting grad school. And so I kind of took this circuitous route into machine learning and computer vision. But it was actually really fortunate looking back. Because a lot of that knowledge in undergrad really set, I think, kind of a strong basis for the way I think and some of the ways I approach problems. And so I can give kind of one example where coming from a different field really helped. At some point a few years ago, people were finding that there was this kind of robustness issue with deep networks. Like if you had an image of a cat, you put it through a classifier, it would say cat. But if you move the image by 1 pixel over, it would give a completely different prediction, which is really bizarre behavior. It really shouldn't be happening if machine learning is really working. And so the community was kind of taking very data driven, very machine learning type centric type approaches to trying to solve this. And I kind of, at that point, I guess, kind of uniquely realized this wasn't really a machine learning problem at its core. It was actually a double D problem. It was a signal processing problem. And so I kind of got myself excited and riled up enough that I kind of banged out a paper. I was sitting at a bubble tea shop for about 2 weeks straight, just working on this thing. So this is the first and last time I'll ever do a single author paper. But basically, because I saw this problem from a different perspective, I was able to go ahead and kind of make that type of contribution. And now every day, I'm actually benefiting a lot from this from my collaborators. I have a lot of great colleagues and interns, and a lot of my best collaborations I actually went back and collated are from interns that came from different backgrounds like math or physics, um, or bio, just seeing problems from different perspectives. That's something I really kind of benefited from my colleagues as well.
Wow, that's such a great story. It's so funny to think about, how some of these things develop.
Mhm.
I know that the focus of this session is mostly talking about, speeding up and dealing with, like, seizing the moment, dealing with a lot of speed. But one thing that has come up a little bit throughout this conversation with both of you is, figuring out, like, when those moments are where you need to slow down, or like when you need to kind of stop and like focus on a problem, and then, like Richard said earlier, that will help you speed up in the long run. I'm curious if there is anything you could share about a time when you kind of had to do that, where there was an instance where, oh, like we need to actually focus on this before we can open the floodgates. Richard, what about
Yeah.
you? Or, sorry, Anna.
Sure. Yeah. I'll give it a shot. So I think I mentioned I was kind of trying to push on. We're working on generative modeling or Gen AI kind of in the early days, um, and machine learning. A lot of the kind of activity and progress has been centered around benchmarks, and that's really driven the field forward. Like having everyone work on common benchmarks, pushing those benchmarks upwards and upwards. Um, that's really been a paradigm that's worked. But what we realized at the time was for generative modeling, we didn't have good benchmarks for doing that. And we had benchmarks, but they weren't really worth optimizing. So um, we had to take a step back and realize, for Gen AI systems, ultimately, we're not trying to push like accuracy up like you are for a classifier. We're trying to create images that look perceptually pleasing to people. And at that point, the only way to evaluate that is to actually ask people if an image looks realistic or looks good. Actually running those perceptual tests um, as you're developing your systems, and doing that takes time. Like it's much easier to write a little script to crank out a number than it is to actually go and run these kind of proper psychophysical tests. But we realized in order to make progress, we actually had to do that. And that led to additional work on actually trying to create good benchmarks and good metrics that are correlated with human perception. So it actually led to kind of a line of fruitful work that's been pretty impactful. And part of that was just taking a step back and realizing the current benchmarks kind of weren't adequate. We needed to take time to run these tests to make new benchmarks that were a little bit more meaningful.
That's great. And this has been such a good conversation. I have one more before we wrap up. I'm so curious about, like, we live in a really fast moving world, and it's often kind of difficult to predict when something specific will take off, like an mRNA vaccine or a particular kind of AI development. So I'd like to take a look at kind of the broader landscape, and I'm wondering, in your opinion, are there any particular factors that contribute to an acceleration of innovation? Are there any that smother it?
For sure. So kind of one big factor of acceleration that we've really noticed in the machine learning computer vision field is that of open sourcing. So I think that's really great. There's kind of this adage that if you want to run um, fast, you go it alone, but if you want to go far, you have to go together. And I really feel in our community we've been very good about working together um, with open publishing and open sourcing. And so of course the recent Gen AI boom that we've seen, a lot of that, yeah, it was like companies that actually scaled it up and were really able to make it work. But you trace these ideas back, they come from academia, they come from having implementations that are open source where we can work together. Um, so we want to, I think, really make sure that continues to happen.
That's wonderful. Thank you both so much. This is unfortunately all the time we have. I think we keep talking about this for a while, but this was great. I really want to thank you for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. This is great.